The regime that promised 1,000 years of power barely survived a decade. Within its borders, millions of men and women grew up convinced they were serving a single cause. The orders were simple. Victory was an obligation. Defeat was unimaginable. But the war did more than destroy cities and armies. It dismantled the very structure that had sustained an idea of greatness. Every decision, every march, every execution was carried out in the name of the same principle: obedience. When it was all over, only the archives, the ruins, and silence remained. What does war look like from the heart of the system that created it? What did those who had sworn loyalty feel as the order they had lived for crumbled before their eyes? What does loyalty mean when the state that demands it no longer exists? The resurgence of the Reich, from national collapse to absolute control. On January 30th, 1933, Germany returned to a decisive stage in its history. Adolf Hitler assumed the chancellorship in a country mired in institutional distrust and economic exhaustion. The defeat of 1918 and the impositions of the Treaty of Versailles had left the Reich politically humiliated and socially precarious. Military restrictions, territorial losses, and reparations imposed by the victorious powers created a persistent sense of injustice. Despite its attempts at stability, the Weimar Republic failed to reverse unemployment or contain political fragmentation. In this void, the National Socialist Party channeled discontent through a narrative that promised to restore national pride and the lost order. In March of that same year, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, granting the government the power to legislate without parliamentary mediation. This measure allowed the regime to gradually eliminate all political opposition. Rival parties were banned, their leaders arrested, and their structures absorbed or dissolved. With the death of President Paul von Hindenburg in August 1934, Hitler unified the roles of Chancellor and Head of State, proclaiming himself Führer of the Reich. A subsequent referendum recorded overwhelming support, presented by propaganda as popular legitimization. In just a few years, Germany had moved from an unstable democracy to an authoritarian regime firmly under the absolute control of the National Socialist Party. The new government focused on military recovery. The Versailles clauses limited the German army to 100,000 troops and prohibited the production of heavy weapons or war aircraft. To evade these restrictions, economist Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank, devised a clandestine financial system known as MEFO bills. Through a fictitious company, the state financed the expansion of the armament industry without recording the expenses in the official budgets. This mechanism allowed resources to be directed toward the war industry without alerting international observers. Within a few years, the Reich's productive capacity grew steadily, strengthening the logistical base for large-scale rearmament. In March 1935, the German government announced the reinstatement of compulsory military service and the official existence of the Luftwaffe. Both decisions openly violated international treaties signed after the First World War. Domestically, they were justified as steps toward normalizing Germany's position among other powers. The official narrative maintained that the country merely sought to equal its neighbors without expansionist intentions. Meanwhile, the army's reorganization advanced in parallel with industrial modernization. Schacht, appointed plenipotentiary for the war economy, coordinated the production and supply of strategic materials, integrating the civilian economy into the state's military planning. On March 7, 1936, German troops entered the demilitarized Rhineland. It was a risky move. Military command had orders to withdraw if France responded forcefully. However, the lack of Allied reaction confirmed the Nazi leadership's assessment of Paris and London's political indecision. The operation was presented to the German people as a legitimate restoration of national territory and a vindication of lost honor. Images of cheering crowds welcoming the troops reinforced the idea that Germany was reclaiming its sovereignty without resorting to open war. The passivity of the Western powers strengthened the internal conviction that the European balance could be altered through unilateral actions. In March 1938, the Reich carried out the annexation of Austria, known as the Anschluss. German forces crossed the border without significant resistance and were met with favorable demonstrations in Vienna and other cities. The regime framed the incorporation as an act of national reunification. That same year, following the Munich Conference, Germany gained control of the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a predominantly German-speaking population. The concession, accepted by Britain and France, was interpreted in Berlin as diplomatic validation of its territorial policy. On the surface, Germany appeared to expand its influence without direct violence, consolidating the perception of a strategic success rooted in firmness and negotiation. During this process, propaganda played a crucial role. Under the direction of Joseph Goebbels, the Ministry of Propaganda unified all media under state control. Radio broadcast official speeches, cinema exalted the Führer's image, and the press propagated a narrative of national rebirth. The population saw visible signs of recovery, unemployment fell, industrial production rose, and public works multiplied. The construction of roads, administrative buildings, and infrastructure projects was presented as tangible evidence of a new era of prosperity. Propaganda linked these achievements to Hitler, portraying him as the architect of Germany's revival. The War of the Reich, Europe, under German expansion. On September 1, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish border at multiple points. The operation, codenamed Fall Weiss, had been prepared by the Wehrmacht High Command for weeks. Motorized and armored columns advanced in converging directions, while the Air Force carried out precision bombings aimed at disrupting communications, destroying command centers, and disorganizing Polish mobilization. Records from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the highest military authority of the Nazi army, detailed troop movements, fuel consumption, and unit progress. The plan relied on a combination of speed, coordination, and air power to achieve the disintegration of the enemy's defensive system. Throughout September, German units advanced on multiple fronts and encircled Warsaw. Fragmented Polish forces lost maneuverability. Staff reports documented the capture of large quantities of material and prisoners, and confirmed that mobile warfare offered decisive advantages over armies structured for linear defense. With the campaign concluded, the territory was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union according to the secret protocols of the German-Soviet Pact. In Berlin, the rapid outcome was interpreted as confirmation of the Reich's operational model. A period of apparent calm followed on the Western Front. During these months, German strategists reorganized divisions, expanded logistical infrastructure, and prepared for future operations. In April 1940, Reich forces carried out campaigns in Scandinavia. Denmark was occupied within hours, and Norway fell after a series of combined landings. From the High Command's perspective, these actions secured maritime routes, control of North Atlantic ports, and access to strategic mineral resources. They were presented as preventive measures against potential British intervention in Northern Europe. On May 10, 1940, the offensive against the West began. German troops penetrated Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, opening the way into France. The operational plan, devised under the direction of Generals von Manstein and Guderian, concentrated the main effort in the Ardennes, a region the Allied command considered impassable for armored formations. The advance through this area allowed the German forces to break the Allied front and encircle their defenses from the rear. Reports from the Oberkommando detailed coordinated movements of tanks, motorized infantry, and Luftwaffe air support. The Blitzkrieg model was confirmed as the central doctrine of German operations. Within weeks, the French defensive lines were overrun. Paris was declared an open city, and the government requested an armistice. On June 22, 1940, Germany imposed the signing of the armistice on France in the same location where in 1918 it had accepted its own defeat. In the Compiègne forest, inside the very same railway carriage, Hitler staged a symbolic humiliation, a historical revenge for the end of the First World War. Official communiques emphasized the symbolic weight of the chosen site and presented the event as a restoration of national prestige. Propaganda materials disseminated by Goebbels' ministry reinforced the image of a total victory, both militarily and politically. Hitler's visit to Paris the following day was carefully orchestrated. The Führer's presence in the French capital was captured by cameras and distributed in newsreels and newspapers as proof of the new European order. Reich radio broadcasts omitted any reference to the material or human costs of the campaign. Domestically, the victory was interpreted as the consolidation of German power over Western Europe and as confirmation of the effectiveness of unified command. Internal documents, however, recorded less optimistic warnings. The operational diaries of the Oberkommando noted logistical tensions, overstretched supply lines, and the need to allocate occupation troops across vast territories. The scale of operations and the maintenance of forces in the field required complex administration that did not always have sufficient resources. Still, the accumulated successes in Poland and France fueled the conviction that the Reich possessed a strategic superiority capable of sustaining a prolonged war. By the end of 1940, the Reich controlled much of continental Europe. Armed forces occupied territories from the Atlantic to the Baltic, and planning was oriented toward a new offensive. In December, the Führerhauptquartier issued Directive No. 21, known as Operation Barbarossa. The document ordered preparations for a campaign against the Soviet Union with the objective of destroying its military power in a brief, concentrated operation. The three planned army groups would advance in separate directions, toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine. The goal was to eliminate the Red Army west of a line stretching from northern to central Russia before it could reorganize. The Eastern Front, the offensive that shattered the invader. On June 22, 1941, German forces crossed the Soviet border in an unprecedented operation. Führerhauptquartier Directive No. 21 had precisely defined the objectives. Army Group North was to advance toward Leningrad, the center toward Moscow, and the south toward Ukraine. The intention was to annihilate the Red Army in the western zone through encirclement maneuvers and deep penetrations, applying the doctrine of mobile warfare developed in previous campaigns. In the first days, Oberkommando reports recorded widespread breaches of Soviet defenses, the destruction of mechanized concentrations, and massive captures of material. Berlin received dispatches describing a rapid, coordinated advance, with the logistical system operating at its limit. During July and August, Army Group Center executed large encirclements in Belarus, including Smolensk, reinforcing the perception of continued success. However, supply records began to show signs of strain. Fuel consumption exceeded forecasts, and some captured Soviet equipment was repurposed to maintain the mobility of the columns. Communications from intermediate commands reported bottlenecks in the railway network, exacerbated by differences in track gauge. To the south, German command prioritized economic resources, control of wheat fields and Donetsk mines, as well as access to routes along the lower Don. Operations in Uman and Kiev resulted in large encirclements and thousands of prisoners, consolidating the occupation of Ukraine. In the north, German forces advanced through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. By early September, the encirclement closed between Emga and Schlisselburg, establishing the blockade line with Finnish support from the Karelian Isthmus. German command judged that an immediate capture of the city was unnecessary if the siege successfully immobilized Soviet defenses. Effective blockade operations began on September 8th. Operational reports described regular bombings of industrial and logistical targets while artillery pressure was maintained. The objective was to enforce total isolation of the city and immobilize Soviet resources. With the arrival of winter, the operational pace slowed. Low temperatures caused mechanical failures, lubricant freezing, and difficulties in supply transport. Supply reports prioritized fuel, ammunition, and winter clothing. The language of public communiques softened the hardships, attributing them to terrain conditions. German units had to adapt their positions to a stationary front while the Red Army reorganized its defenses. By the end of 1941, the offensive on Moscow had stalled. The Oberkommando recorded the impossibility of sustaining the initial momentum in the face of growing resistance and logistical exhaustion. In the summer of 1942, German command shifted its main effort to the south under the designation Fall Blau. The objective was to secure the Volga and the resources of the Caucasus. Army Group B advanced towards Stalingrad, a key point in the Soviet communications network. Operational reports highlighted sustained progress along the Don and Volga rivers. Within the city, the 6th Army reported intense urban combat, high ammunition consumption, and accelerated personnel losses. Coordination between the Luftwaffe and ground units was hampered by poor visibility and the proximity of enemy lines. Progress continued, but internal records revealed material deterioration and overextension of flanks held by Axis Allied units. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet Urano offensive was launched against the northern and southern sectors of Stalingrad. Public Reich communiques spoke of intense attacks along the Don front, but internal reports already acknowledged the danger of encirclement. The Oberkommando ordered Operation Wintergewitter, a relief maneuver with the 4th Panzer Army from the southwest. The initial phases achieved limited progress, hindered by Soviet anti-tank fire and a shortage of fuel. Within the perimeter, the 6th Army reported shortages of food, reduced rations, and a loss of mobility. The Luftwaffe reported that the tonnage delivered by air fell short of planned levels due to weather conditions and transport aircraft losses. Public communiques maintained a tone of steadfast resistance without mentioning the true situation of the encirclement. Between January 31st and February 2nd, 1943, the majority of the 6th Army was captured at Stalingrad. Reports of the surrender were issued in technical language, omitting details about casualties or unit destruction. Meanwhile, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt's Einsatzgruppen operated in the rear of the army groups. Their periodic reports documented executions of political commissars, members of the Soviet Party, and Jewish populations, alongside the confiscation of property and operations described as pacification. Security reports indicated coordination with Wehrmacht territorial commands to maintain control in occupied areas. These activities were recorded with administrative precision, reflecting the integration of the security apparatus into the military structure on the Eastern Front. During 1941 and 1942, Reich propaganda maintained the narrative of a preventive defense against communism. Wehrmacht communiques presented the campaign as a continental effort to preserve European stability, the bureaucracy of extermination. The state turned into a machine of death. In 1941, the Reich's administrative structures consolidated their role in the persecution and systematic murder of populations designated as enemies of the state. The SS, Gestapo, Party Security Service, and police unified competencies under a centralized hierarchy. The Reichssicherheitshauptamt, established in 1939, became the organizational core of this apparatus. Through its structure, the Nazi state integrated policing, intelligence, and civil administration into a system coordinating arrests, deportations, and executions. On January 20, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich presided over the Wannsee Conference, a meeting aimed at coordinating cooperation between ministries and agencies in implementing the so-called final solution to the Jewish question. The protocol drafted afterward, under the supervision of Adolf Eichmann, established the systematic deportation of Jews from across Europe to occupied Eastern territories. The document defined the responsibilities of each agency, from planning transport to guarding deportees, ensuring that administrative decisions flowed to the ultimate authority of the Reichsführer SS. The conference formalized a framework of bureaucratic collaboration that allowed the civil state to be integrated into the process of extermination without the need for new public legislation. The text recognized that emigration was no longer a viable solution and that mass deportation had become the new method of action. Representatives from various ministries accepted the general directive and requested that implementation be carried out discreetly to avoid public alarm. The document estimated the European Jewish population subject to deportation at over 11 million. From this coordination, the administrative machinery was activated with increasing precision. Transfer orders were drafted in bureaucratic language, using terms such as evacuation or resettlement, concealing the true nature of the final destination. During the same year, railway convoys began transporting groups from various Reich territories and occupied zones to the extermination centers established in Poland. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec were integrated into a network of camps connected to the Reich's railway infrastructure. Deportation lists were signed or approved by the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, which coordinated security and logistics among ministries, provincial authorities, and police. Correspondence between offices reflects the routine nature of the process: calculations of capacity, transport schedules, assignment of guards, and availability of railcars. Every step was documented through forms and reports, giving an appearance of administrative normality to an operation of extermination. Field reports show that, in many regions, local authorities and auxiliary police provided support. In towns within the general government and occupied Eastern territories, collaborationist units were formed to handle surveillance, custody, and detention. Documentation indicates that these forces operated under the supervision of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt and local SS commanders. Coordination across hierarchical levels allowed the uniform implementation of racial policies over large areas, while propaganda maintained the narrative of internal security and defense of the German people. The extermination apparatus was characterized by its structured division of responsibilities. The Reichssicherheitshauptamt issued directives, civil ministries collaborated in their execution, and the Gestapo managed the detention and delivery of prisoners. The Reich railways organized transport itineraries according to requests from the Interior Ministry, or the SS bureaucratic administration turned murder into a technical procedure composed of documented stages, supervised and adjusted through performance reports. Internal communications of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt preserve an administrative tone, referencing train occupation, transit times, and interdepartmental coordination needs. In January 1943, Heinrich Himmler delivered a speech to senior officials of the Reichssicherheitshauptamt on the occasion of Ernst Kaltenbrunner's appointment as its new head. In his address, he emphasized the continuity of security policy and the importance of maintaining secrecy regarding ongoing operations. By that time, the extermination structure was fully integrated across command levels. The Einsatzgruppen continued operating behind the Eastern Front lines, carrying out mass shootings of political commissars, Soviet party cadres, and Jewish populations. Their reports, sent periodically to Berlin, detailed numbers, dates, and locations with the same accounting precision as any other administrative report. Within the Reich, propaganda avoided explicit references to the killings. Official media continued to speak of resettlements and racial security measures. Public rhetoric stressed the need to protect the German people from supposed biological and political dangers. This discourse, disseminated through radio, press, and posters, provided ideological justification for the process while keeping the general population unaware of the true operations. Bureaucracy, without the need for emotional mobilization, turned racial policy into an institutional routine. In the occupied zones, the administrative system demonstrated its adaptability. When military conditions changed, transport routes were altered, and camps were evacuated or reconfigured according to orders from the Reichssicherheitshauptamt. Correspondence from regional commanders mentions adjustments of itineraries, reassignment of trains, and forced resettlement of populations in response to enemy advances. The central structure maintained control through compliance reports, list verification, and statistical monitoring. Total war, the nation subjugated to its own conflict. On February 18, 1943, Joseph Goebbels delivered a speech at the Berlin Sport Palace that summarized the new direction of the Reich. In a direct tone, he asked his audience whether they desired total war. The collective response was used by the regime to legitimize the absolute intensification of the war effort. In official documents, the speech was presented as a tribute to the fallen Sixth Army at Stalingrad and as the starting point for comprehensive mobilization. The state ordered the closure of cinemas, theaters, and non-essential establishments, redirecting labor and resources toward military production. The concept of total war became the guiding principle of domestic policy. Within weeks, German territory began experiencing large-scale bombings. Between July 24 and August 3, 1943, Operation Gomorrah devastated Hamburg through a series of combined attacks. British bombers struck residential areas at night, while American formations targeted industrial and port facilities during the day. Municipal reports describe widespread fires, destruction of homes, and heavy human losses. Local authorities recorded 7 major raids that generated firestorms and the collapse of the urban infrastructure. Official communiques presented the events as proof of national resilience, minimizing the extent of the damage and glorifying the steadfastness of the German people. Similar attacks occurred in Berlin, Kassel, and later Dresden, although internal sources reflected the growing difficulty in maintaining order and basic services in the affected cities. The intensification of the bombing led to the mobilization of civilian sectors. Youth from the Hitler Youth were assigned auxiliary duties in air defense, communications, and first aid. Local authorities organized night watch units and rescue brigades. In 1944, the regime formalized the creation of the Volkssturm, a corps designed to incorporate men between 16 and 60 years old who were not serving at the front. Its members received minimal training, light weaponry, and defensive responsibilities in urban areas. Contemporary documents show that this measure aimed to compensate for regular army losses and maintain internal cohesion under the principle of total territorial defense. Civilian life faced a progressive deterioration in living conditions. Food supplies became irregular. State propaganda promoted single-dish meals and simplified menus as symbols of patriotic austerity. The distribution of meat, bread, and fats was strictly rationed. Records from the Ministry of Food show that weekly quotas were reduced in correspondence with increasing military consumption. Internal transportation was also affected. Railways were frequently bombed, fuel was prioritized for the military, and shortages of rolling stock caused continuous delays. Reports from the Transport Office mentioned congestion along supply routes and constant diversions to military targets. The healthcare system experienced a partial collapse. Hospitals damaged by bombings were relocated or merged, and part of the medical staff was recruited for the front. The lack of medicine, stretchers, and fuel for ambulances complicated care for civilian casualties. Municipal health records document improvised hospitals set up in schools, basements, or subway stations. In censored correspondence, local doctors reported that available resources were insufficient for the population's needs. In contrast, official propaganda glorified the dedication of medical personnel and presented resistance to suffering as a national duty. Allied air campaigns transformed the daily structure of German cities. The population lived under frequent alarms and a civil defense system regulating schedules, blackouts, and movement. Authorities distributed manuals on behavior during attacks and procedures in shelters. Entire families spent nights in basements or underground stations. Many children were evacuated to rural areas under temporary relocation programs. Municipal reports record the organization of shelters, assignment of safety zones, and blackout control to avoid detection from the air. In this context, the line between front and rear disappeared. Civilian life was completely subordinated to the demands of war. Industrial production was restructured to sustain the war effort. Factories previously producing consumer goods were converted into armament plants. The mass incorporation of women into industrial work helped cover part of the labor shortage. Foreign workers and prisoners of war were also employed under harsh conditions. Reports from the Ministry of Armaments show sustained increases in the production of tanks, aircraft, and ammunition during 1943 and 1944, despite bombing damage. Plants were decentralized and moved to underground facilities or tunnels to avoid direct destruction. This process was accompanied by strict monitoring of productivity, quota fulfillment, and labor discipline. Fuel became a high-priority resource. Dependence on Romanian refineries and German synthetic production limited military operations and reduced civilian consumption to minimal levels. Private vehicles were banned and urban transport was restricted. Reports from the Ministry of Economics note a severe redistribution of fuel to the Luftwaffe and armored divisions, with nearly total rationing for domestic use. Coal was also scarce, causing interruptions in heating and electricity during the winters of 1943 and 1944. The end of the Reich, the power structure in ruins. By early 1945, the Third Reich showed definitive signs of collapse. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht recorded in its daily reports the disintegration of the Eastern Front, a lack of reserves, and the loss of operational capacity. On January 12th, the Red Army launched the Vistula Oder offensive, a massive operation that rapidly penetrated the heart of German territory. Defensive lines, composed of remnants of panzer divisions, Volkssturm militias and youth units, could not halt the advance. The Oder line became the last barrier before Berlin. Command reports from Heeresgruppe Weichsel reflected troop exhaustion, fuel shortages, and disrupted communications. In his orders, General Heinrici insisted on holding the Seelow Heights, even though reserves and air support were no longer available. The final offensive, Berlin and the collapse of the Reich. On April 16, 1945, the final Soviet offensive against Berlin began. The First Belarusian Front and the First Ukrainian Front opened fire with unprecedented artillery bombardments. Within 3 days, the outer defenses collapsed. Reports from the capital described lost contact with northern divisions, disintegrated units, and the gradual fall of the eastern suburbs. By April 20th, Hitler's birthday, The first Soviet tanks had reached the city limits. Internal records show a fragmented command structure, even as the Führer's orders continued to demand total resistance. Inside the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and a small group of officers remained. Communications were maintained through irregular teletype links with Flensburg, where Admiral Karl Dönitz directed Baltic naval operations. General Helmuth Weidling assumed command of Berlin's defense with scattered forces composed of regular soldiers, Waffen-SS, police and Hitler Youth adolescents. By April 25th, Berlin was completely encircled. The Oberkommando War Diary recorded a coherent operation for the last time that day. Divisions had been reduced to small combat groups. Subway tunnels served as both communication routes and civilian shelters. On the surface, broadcasts from Reichssender Berlin insisted on resistance, even as reports from the Ministry of Propaganda acknowledged the collapse of public morale. On April 28th, news arrived of Benito Mussolini's execution in Italy. Aware of the imminent outcome, Hitler dictated his political testament in the presence of his secretaries and Goebbels. He appointed Dönitz as President of the Reich and Goebbels as Chancellor. On the afternoon of April 29th, he signed his final military orders. Around 3 p.m. on April 30th, he committed suicide in his bunker office. Eva Braun died alongside him by poisoning. Their bodies were carried to the Chancellery Garden and burned by personal aides, following prior instructions. Goebbels assumed political control for less than a day before also taking his life along with his family. With their deaths, the central government of the Reich ceased to exist. On May 2, 1945, General Helmuth Weidling signed the surrender of the last German forces defending Berlin. Fighting ended that same day. Red Army reports counted more than 100,000 prisoners in the capital. Berlin's defense had lasted 2 weeks. Meanwhile, Dönitz attempted to maintain an administration in Flensburg, near the Danish border, aiming to negotiate partial surrenders with the Western Allies and facilitate the evacuation of civilians and troops from the east. On May 7th in Reims, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces before General Dwight D. Eisenhower. To satisfy the Soviet Union, a second signing took place in Berlin-Karlshorst on May 8th. Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the final document before Marshal Georgy Zhukov and representatives from the United States, United Kingdom and France. With this act, the Reich ceased to exist as a political and military entity. After the surrender, state structures were dissolved. Ministries, offices and military commands came under Allied control. The former Reich territories were divided into 4 occupation zones: Soviet, American, British and French. In Berlin, the Soviet administration established a provisional command responsible for restoring basic services and maintaining security. Initial orders demanded the surrender of weapons, identification of Nazi officials and reopening of hospitals. Soviet reports describe a devastated city, destroyed infrastructure, streets filled with rubble, and shelters overcrowded with civilians. The urban system had almost completely collapsed. On May 23rd, British forces dissolved the Flensburg government. Dönitz, Jodl, and the remaining cabinet members were arrested. Hermann Göring had been captured in Bavaria, and Wilhelm Keitel detained shortly thereafter. All were transferred to prisoner-of-war camps for subsequent trials. In parallel, the Allies began a process of joint administration. Immediate priorities included preventing famine, restoring transport, and controlling the movement of millions of displaced persons. Reports from the Red Cross and Allied military authorities describe a critical situation: food shortages, disease, destroyed housing, and massive population displacements. After the collapse, occupation, justice, and reconstruction. In June 1945, the Allies issued orders dissolving the Nazi Party and all its affiliated organizations. Regime symbols were removed, racial laws annulled, and Nazi courts suspended. Military tribunals and local administrations under Allied supervision replaced them. Reich archives were seized and transported to London, Washington, and Moscow. Captured top leaders were later tried in Nuremberg. Germany was divided into occupation zones, each with separate civil structures and policies: guilt and reconstruction, Germany facing its history. After the May 1945 surrender, Germany was split into 4 occupation zones managed by the victorious powers: Soviet, American, British, and French. Each authority imposed its model of governance, justice, and social reorganization. Reconstruction was not only about rebuilding cities and infrastructure, but also redefining the country's moral and political foundation. In November 1945, the International Military Tribunal opened in Nuremberg to prosecute the principal Nazi leaders. The tribunal, composed of judges from the four Allied powers, sat until October 1946. 22 defendants faced charges of war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. Among them were Hermann Göring, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Frick, and Baldur von Schirach. Albert Speer, the armament minister, appeared as a representative of the Reich's technical and administrative apparatus. The trials established legal and documentary precedents, presenting thousands of official Nazi documents, military orders, and testimonies on extermination policies. The verdicts of October 1, 1946, sentenced most defendants to death or prison and declared organizations like the SS, Gestapo, and Party Leadership Corps criminal, allowing subsequent investigations to target their members. The trials served both as individual condemnation and a structured record of the inner workings of the regime. Concurrently, the occupation powers implemented denazification programs. In the American zone, a classification system using questionnaires and local hearings determined each citizen's involvement with the Nazi Party. In the Soviet zone, the process focused on removing political elites and reorganizing the economy under a socialist model. The Potsdam Agreement outlined the need to eradicate Nazism, democratize institutions, and restructure Germany's economy. Political division gradually solidified. In the West, Reconstruction followed a liberal, capitalist model, while the East adopted a centrally planned system under Soviet control. Results were uneven. Some regions held local trials for minor officials, while others applied exclusion lists without judicial proceedings. Over time, Allied priorities shifted from total punishment to administrative stability. During these years, former Reich leaders published memoirs or statements attempting to reinterpret their responsibilities. Albert Speer claimed ignorance of extermination crimes, portraying himself as a technocrat uninvolved in genocidal decisions. Baldur von Schirach partially acknowledged guilt, while Rudolf Höss, former Auschwitz commandant, provided detailed written testimonies about the death camp system. These documents, circulated through the press and court proceedings, cemented public understanding of the Reich's vast criminal apparatus. Between 1945 and 1949, German society experienced a period of moral uncertainty. In the first months, survival was the priority, rebuilding homes, securing food, and restoring basic services. Many citizens viewed the Nuremberg trials as impositions by the victors. However, the presentation of evidence, official publications, and education promoted by the occupying powers gradually introduced the notion of collective responsibility. Schools, libraries, and media began disseminating material on the Holocaust, concentration camps, and extermination campaigns. In the Western zones, the censorship of the Nazi past was accompanied by the promotion of democratic values and civil rights. In the Soviet zone, propaganda focused on denouncing fascism as an ideological enemy and consolidating a new socialist order. The debate over guilt and responsibility was not uniform. In some German states, the idea of national victimhood persisted, centered on the bombings and occupation. But with the emergence of younger generations who had not participated in the war, broader spaces for discussion began to form. The Allied authorities encouraged this process through educational programs, film productions, and documentary exhibitions. The memory of the Reich became part of the political and cultural discourse, fostering the idea that moral reconstruction should accompany material reconstruction. Economic recovery progressed slowly in the early years. Cities showed high levels of destruction, disrupted rail networks, collapsed bridges, and unusable factories. Occupation authorities prioritized the restoration of water, electricity, transportation, and hospitals. In 1948, the Marshall Plan introduced financial and material resources to the Western zones. This program enabled industrial reactivation and urban reconstruction, generating employment and monetary stabilization. In the East, The economic model relied on nationalizations and reparations to the Soviet Union, which slowed recovery. The economic divergence between the two zones marked the beginning of post-war German division. The return of millions of prisoners of war added pressure to the process. Many soldiers, especially those captured on the Eastern Front, returned years later in precarious conditions. Allied repatriation reports documented long delays, illness, and difficulties with reintegration. Women played a crucial role in the physical reconstruction of cities. The so-called Trümmerfrauen, or women of the rubble, cleared ruins, recovered reusable materials, and prepared sites for new construction. Their work, visible in photographs and municipal reports, became a symbol of collective effort and civilian resilience. Politically, the Western powers supervised the creation of democratic institutions. Political parties, unions, and local elections were authorized from 1946 onward under Allied oversight. In the Eastern Zone, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany consolidated its control through mergers and the elimination of opposition. The political division was formalized with the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany in May 1949 and the German Democratic Republic in October of the same year. Both states emerged on opposing ideological foundations, but shared the task of rebuilding a devastated nation. During this period, Germany began to redefine its identity. Educational reforms eliminated propagandistic content, revised textbooks, and promoted civic values. Denazification of the school system became a priority for the occupying powers. Universities reopened under international supervision, and debates arose regarding the role of science and administration during the previous regime. Amid material ruins and moral discussions, German society began a comprehensive process of reconstruction that combined memory, justice, and institutional reorganization. The country had to rebuild not only its cities, but also its political and moral conscience, within a context of division that would shape its future history.